I am your host, Dr. Mildred Fay Jefferson, and this is Life Matters. Our program is brought to you by the Margaret O'Hara, West Roxbury, Roslindale chapter of Massachusetts Citizens for Life. And before I introduce our very interesting and much welcomed guest, I will read for you the mission statement of Massachusetts Citizens for Life. You can follow it on our screen, but I always read it to remind myself of why we are here. In recognition of the fact that each human life is a continuum from conception to natural death, the mission of Massachusetts Citizens for Life Incorporated is to promote respect for human life and to defend the right to life of all human beings, born and preborn. We will influence public policy at the local, state, and national levels through comprehensive educational, legislative, political, and charitable activities. And now, I want to bring before you a much honored guest. Many of you will remember him. Some of you may not have known him, but it reflects a time of what I would call great promise and political excitement in our Commonwealth. Our guest today is the Honorable Edward F. King, who was a former Republican candidate for governor of the Commonwealth. And we will tell you a little more about that later, because we had the very interesting prospect of two candidates with the same last name appearing on the ballot at the same time.
Same first name, too.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Welcome, Edward
Thank you, Dr.
F.
Jefferson.
King.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm so happy to have you here. Now, for those who were not following politics then, tell them a little about you. You are a native of Massachusetts.
Yes, I was born and raised in western Massachusetts in the small town of Adams, and came to Boston at the age of 17 to attend college, and then met my wife and stayed in the Boston area. Got involved in politics shortly after that. I must say that my big issue, and the one that I was probably closely identified with, was the tax issue.
Yes.
I was the tax man. I was the founder of Citizens for Limited Taxation, and that was how I really got started in politics, was the anti-tax movement. But rest assured, I was always 100% solidly, without exception, on the side of the pro-life movement.
Well, that is one thing I wanted very much for you to bring up, because now, unfortunately, many of the political consultants, both Democrat and Republican, are advising their candidates not to return their questionnaires so that they can somehow straddle the fence and leave their own position somewhat poorly defined. And you not at any point tried to either wiggle or stand on both sides of the issue. You came out very clearly and forthrightly as a candidate who would defend the right to life.
Well, I always felt, and I still feel today, that the true leaders, the ones that will be remembered in history, are not the ones that bend with the tide and try to take both sides of the issue, but the ones that lead. If you think you're right, you don't need to take a poll.
Right.
You know, and it's the job of political leadership to sell their philosophy and their rightness, if they believe they're right, to the people, and not vice versa. Unfortunately, we have too many politicians in both parties who do that first, you know, and then decide where they're going to go. I would have much more respect for someone who disagrees with me on principle than I would for someone who agrees with me today and disagrees with me tomorrow.
Yes. Well, now, people have heard the name CLT, Citizens for Limited Taxation. How did you happen to decide you had to do something here in Massachusetts and bring the people together in a way they could be effective?
Citizens for Limited Taxation was founded in 1973 and the fact of the matter is that we copied, to a large extent, the tax limitation movement that existed in California. Many of the older people that are watching the program will remember the names Howard Jarvis and I'm trying to remember some of the others, but he's the one that sticks out.
He's the one that everyone
everybody
who knows about it remembers.
And they began a tax limitation movement in California that spread like wildfire across the country. And we felt in Massachusetts that we had a debate going on, and we did. And the debate was which tax to raise. And the Republicans traditionally would say, well, we ought to have more sales tax and more use taxes. And the Democrats would say we ought to raise the income tax. We didn't have anybody that would stand up and say, we don't need new taxes. We need to control spending. We need to get control of our government. And so we felt, a group of us felt, that there should be an organization that represented the average taxpayer. And that's how Citizens for Limited Taxation was born. And of course, Proposition 2.5 was one of the brainchilds of Citizens for Limited Taxation, and still exists, was passed by the voters. And despite numerous attempts to gut it in the legislature, it still survives very close to its original form.
Well, you know, there were very many interesting things once you had moved through that transition of citizen activism and recognized that it wasn't enough to just appeal to those who were already in elective office. You may as well throw your hat in the ring as well. How did you get to that point?
Well, you know, it was interesting because I was always interested in and active in the Republican Party. I was a member of the Republican State Committee. I got elected deputy chairman of the Republican State Committee. And as 1978 approached, there were two other Republican candidates who indicated they wanted to run for governor. And both of them came from the very liberal wing of the Republican Party.
The Rockefeller wing.
Well, yeah, we didn't call it the Rockefeller wing in those days, but it was the liberal wing of the Republican Party, and many people felt that there was enough of a conservative point of view within the Republican Party that should be represented in that Republican convention in 1978 and then later on in the primary. The favorite candidate from the right side, though, was a fellow by the name of David Locke, who was a state senator.
Yes.
And a wonderful guy and a great senator and a good man. And he decided he did not want to run. And he made it clear very early that year that he was not going to run. And he looked at me one time and he said, why don't you do it? You know? And that's sort of how it started.
Oh, wonderful.
And we went from there. And got a grassroots movement. I think maybe one of the most surprised people when I won the convention was me. Because it was really, it started out like a protest movement in order to make a point. And it caught fire, and I won that convention in 1978 and woke up the next day and said, you know, what do we do now?
Well, that was very exciting because your opponent, who went on eventually to win the Republican primary, was certainly no one to sneeze at as a Republican politician.
No. We had two other very good candidates. One of them was the minority leader in the House of Representatives, good and decent and honorable man, who was just too liberal for me, and the sheriff of Middlesex County, our largest county, who was a good and decent and honorable man and too liberal for me. So that was... the debate was a philosophical one. It had to do with, you know, where you wanted to be on the issues.
Well, you know, I wish we had more time than we have because I have to leave out so much. But one thing I want our viewers to remember as they learn something about the exciting political history of Massachusetts is that you were contesting with Hatch, who was the name of your Republican opponent, but trying to win the Republican primary as Edward F. King. On the Democratic side, the ticket was headed by Edward J. King.
Yes.
And Edward J. King had been a very famous football player.
Yes, indeed.
So now tell me, did that cause a few little confusions for you?
Oh, sometimes I wish that right after that campaign, I had taken the time to write a book because I could have filled up several chapters with funny and humorous things that happened because of the mistakes. People thought I was he, and they thought that he was Edward F. King, and they kept getting confused. But I think one of the best ones, it's hard to tell on television, but I'm not a very big man. I'm 5'7", and right now I'm too heavy, but back in those days, I probably weighed about 145 pounds. And I had a request one time to go and speak before a group, and I went. And after it was over, the head of the group wanted to meet with me privately. And he took me into his office, and I sat down on the couch, and he immediately said, "Would you mind standing up again?" And I said, "No, I don't mind." I stood up, and he looked me up and down, and he said, "How in the world did a little guy like you ever survive in the National Football League?" And it immediately came to me that he had invited me to this speaking engagement, had me speak to these several hundred people, and they had the wrong guy there. And the speech went very well, you know, so I must have done all right. But things like that happened to us all the while, and we had a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun with it and made jokes of it.
Who did not know, for then Democratic candidate for governor Edward J. King, he was quite a few inches above 5'7".
Oh, he was a big man. He was a former professional football player. He was a football star at Boston College, and then went on and played pro football. He was a big and powerful-looking man with broad shoulders and a big chest, and certainly, you know, looked like a professional football player. I certainly did not. And but we had a lot of funny things happen to us during that campaign. I actually showed up at one of his fundraisers because we got lost, and the fellow that was driving my car stopped and asked directions of the police officer, and the police officer had no idea where we were asking about. He just couldn't understand what we wanted to do. And finally, the driver said, "We're going to a fundraiser for Ed King for governor." And the policeman said, "Oh," and then he told us where to go, but he sent us to one of their
the wrong one.
Yeah, and I walked in there to no applause, couldn't understand why people weren't standing and applauding for me when I was in the wrong place.
That is something, but that was exciting for us, and the reason we have brought this story forward is that Edward F. King was competing for the Republican nomination for governor as a pro-life candidate, and Edward J. King was running on the Democratic candidate for governor as a pro-life candidate. And because they were crisscrossing the state, two Ed Kings, even though our Edward F. King did not win his primary, Edward J. King was on the final ballot. And of course, King was king. So people went out and voted for Ed King. So it benefited us all because we ended up with the last Democratic governor who was pro-life.
I remember Peter Fuller, the Cadillac Olds owner, had a big sign on his automobile dealership. I remember seeing it driving by one night during the campaign, and I thought it was hysterical. I thought he had a very good sense of humor. A big sign said, "Ed King for governor," and then underneath it, "Either one." So,
I like that. In fact, I hope you have a picture of that so we can go into our archives in case we ever have a state or national archives for the right to life. But that brings us to a very critical point, why it is necessary for us to elect candidates to office who will steadfastly defend the right to life, because that really is the cornerstone and foundation of our democratic Republican form of government.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that, you know, one of the things that I've watched in frustration over the years, and you just said it, you said defend the right to life position. I would like very much for us to turn that around. I think the other side ought to defend their willingness to kill. That's a much more difficult thing to defend.
That's why they evade the discussion and they switch off to the right to choose. Oh, well, it's not really what the choice is, it's who makes the choice. Everything to evade what you're talking about in demanding the private right to kill little growing baby within its mother's womb without giving him or her a chance a chance to get outside to join the rest of the family.
I think the right to life movement needs to take a long, hard look, not at its philosophy and not at its beliefs, because those are correct, but at the strategy, at the debating strategy.
Yes.
It's time to reconsider what we're doing and what we're saying, because it's not working. We keep losing elections, and our candidates are getting wishy-washy. I had a candidate for Congress come to my house one day and sit in my kitchen after I had run for office and lost, and asking for my support, financial and otherwise. And I remember saying to him, and members of my family were present, I remember saying to him, the only issue that I'm going to ask you about is the abortion issue. And he insisted that he was pro-life, no exceptions, and that that was the one issue that he could never compromise on.
Oh.
I supported him, I gave him money, he ran for Congress, he won, and within 3 months in Washington, he was voting
accommodating the other side.
Yes, accommodating the other side. And my wife, my older children, and I all heard him say that, and we were absolutely horrified. How could that's the one issue, he said, on which I will never compromise.
Well, I can tell you why they are doing this. They are doing it because as our grassroots movement has come into a position of not reliably protecting the friends of life and punishing the anti-life candidates, they have come to the idea that they really don't have to take into any consideration at all the viewpoints of the Right to Life movement. And this is a call that has to be answered. The value, again, of having a pro-life candidate, a right-to-life candidate who holds fast, was represented just within recent events when President Bush had before him a bill passed by the U.S. Senate and the House which would have enabled government funding to be used for embryonic stem cell research, which enables the killing of the human baby at its earliest stage of development for the benefit of research scientists. He said no. And in spite of the fact that polls were waved at him here and there,
and in spite of the fact that he had never vetoed a bill.
Yes.
And that was the one that stimulated him to use that veto for the first time. So obviously he did feel very strongly about it, and rightly so. I really believe that if you present the right to life issue properly and advance it properly and stand your ground, that people can understand the issue.
Oh, I know that it's true, because when I was elected president of National Right to Life Committee, the election was in Denver, so we had to go from Denver back to Washington to be there Monday morning to open the offices. And I went back to Washington with 3 objectives. Number 1, to change the perception of right to life on Capitol Hill and in the country, to try to change the tenor of the public dialogue so that we could frame the issues and therefore be able to shape the discussion. And the third, of course, was to be able to generate the action and more than 50% of the time be able to control the outcome. But to do that, we had to anchor the discussion squarely on defending the right to life. Whenever you move out into abortion and the periphery, the right to choose and all of the other evasive arguments, you simply let the opponents have all of their well-practiced propaganda schemes, and it is of a certain benefit to them. Right now, we've got to move the discussion of stem cell research. You will notice that in reporting the historic activities of the Washington legislation, about a quarter of the stations are careful to tell the viewing public that the contention is over embryonic stem cell research. It is very dishonest of them to lump everything together, and we have the embarrassment again of Senators Kerry and Kennedy, again acting with scientists who are not acting as scientists to me at all, but they're acting as spoiled brats, which you will hear me say over and over again, demanding to do what they know is unethical simply because it's what they want to do. But my argument with Senators Kerry and Kennedy is that they know that there is no justification for their trying to use the might and power of government to force those of us who will not agree to this moral and ethical violation of killing the innocent human baby at its earliest stage of development for whatever justifications
Yeah,
they
it doesn't
will
matter.
use.
There is no justification.
No
There are some
justification.
absolutes. And I think that is the proper approach that the Right to Life movement ought to take. I think the debate that's gone on over all these years is over. And
Yes.
the debate, we've won.
Yes.
It is wrong to kill innocent, unborn life, period. It's always
Yes.
wrong.
And I would like all of our viewers and all of those others to understand we are very sympathetic with those who have dread diseases.
Of course, of course.
And we want to find cures for all of the things that bring about human suffering. But we know very well there is never a justification of any cure that depends on killing an innocent human being. Well, I am so happy to have our almost Governor Edward F. King,
Thank you.
Republican, here with us today, and he has a standing invitation because he is part of our chapter area, and we certainly expect him to become an active member. Thank you so much for joining us with Life Matters, and come back and see us again next Thursday at 2:30 p.m. I am your host, Dr. Mildred Fay Jefferson, and remember, the fight for the right to life is not the cause of a special few, but the cause of every man, woman, and child who cares not only about his own family, but about the entire family of man. Join us again next week.